and welcome back to my channel, Talented Reads. I am back with another wrap-up video, which is my October wrap-up for the Horror Challenge. From our lovely graphic, I am still traveling through the monster section. October was all about classic and mythological. I would say I did more classic than I did for anything, and I would venture to say that of all the subgenres listed on this graphic, I think this one is the most subjected to personal preference, and even probably the most that crosses over with other subgenres. I think age plays a role in what someone thinks of as a classic, as well as what type of horror that person might even prefer. I was born in the 80s, and it wasn't until the 90s that I was watching horror movies. So my first introduction to horror movies was stuff like The Exorcist, Hellraiser, Alien, movies that came out in the 70s and 80s. So to me, those are classic horror movies. But, you get to talking with people who are, really into the horror genre, and they're talking, B-rated horror movies and even stuff farther back, like The Blob, any of the Alfred Hitchcock movies, or even Vincent Price for that matter. So although I'll be talking about some of my favorites in the recommendation, this is by far not an expansive list. I've narrowed it down to 4, kind of trying to hit a lot of those different age ranges and movies that I think are classics for different reasons. But understand there's a lot more that I could put on this list. I also pulled up a lot of lists on the internet and Reddit, which was a great help. And getting classic and book movie recommendations for myself to read and watch. So let's get into it. In October, I read a total of 5 classic horror books. Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. Cooter and Dark's Pandemonium Shadow Show has come to Greentown, Illinois. Though the town is feeding into the carnival's hypnotic power, 2 boys will uncover its dark secrets. I can't believe I've gone all this time and haven't read such a classic horror book. This was a surprisingly interesting read. I loved the backdrop of the carnival, and Halloween time seemed like the most appropriate time to read this because it is set around Halloween time. So, obviously if you're reading it in the right season, you just get that much more into the book. I thought there were a lot of themes that Ray tackled in this book, which I appreciate. Things like aging, balancing the darkness that's in life with light, etc. There were certainly a number of really great quotes and passages, a lot of really memorable things that occurred in the book. Where this fell a little short for me was ultimately the 2 boys and the ending. I almost get the sense that the symbolism of the 2 boys is one is good and one is evil. So he's prone to just siding with the dark side of the carnival, just because he is. It was never explained, but it's that's just the way he is. He just likes the dark side. It was I don't know, there's all these great explanations and exploring of themes, and that one kind of just, got brushed aside a little bit. And although I always do like a big battle at the end, this one did seem to drag out a little bit. a lot of villainous monologues. It's like, someone please just end it. And this is actually book 2 in the Greentown series. Someone told me that I didn't need to have read the first book, and I would completely agree with that. I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything. But I will say at this point, I'm not really compelled to read any of the other books. So, yeah. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. The newly married Mrs. De Winter arrives at the Manderley feeling out of her elements, and the ghost of Rebecca still remains. So I have to admit, I was a little nervous going into this because it was like first published in the 30s or something. So, of course, I was thinking I just wouldn't vibe with the language and the references, but I quite enjoyed this. This was on so many classic horror novel lists that I pulled off the internet. And I guess this kind of goes with some of the other ones that I read, but this one could be controversial if it's actually horror. To me, this seemed more like a mystery thriller. I mean, I think there are some soft horror elements, and maybe it was horrific at the time that it was written, but I think the mystery of what really happened to Rebecca is really what's prevalent throughout the whole book. And I love the heck out of that. We had a really lovely, atmospheric vibes at Manderley, and some of the creepy servants, especially Mrs. Danvers. The main character, our new Mrs. De Winter, had some really nice character growth, which I appreciated. And I'm honestly really happy I enjoyed this because I have this beautiful edition from Folio Society. It's a nice, heavy hardback with illustrations. And it comes in this little sleeve, which, just adds to the reading experience. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Let me read the synopsis to you. Oscar Wilde's only novel is the dreamlike story of a young man who sells his soul for eternal youth and beauty. I mean, does that not sound good or what? Dorian Gray basically lives his life in the painting of him, sees the signs of age, and absorbs all of that instead of Dorian himself. So, he obviously keeps that painting hidden from the rest of the world. So I have read this, but it's been years. And although, I never forgot the main premise, I had basically forgotten, everything else about the book. I didn't love this one, but I did enjoy it. It does have some good gothic horror elements, and of course, a pretty big psychological undertone, which I always enjoy. I was actually kind of surprised that I didn't care for Dorian's character himself in this book. And I really didn't like Lord Henry. God, that man was a terrible influence. Yeah. But of course, to me, this is a classic horror book, so I'm glad to have reread it. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a large collection of Edgar Allan Poe's tales and poems. This book is part of the Penguin Horror Collection, which was curated by Guillermo del Toro. And to me, when I think classic horror, Edgar Allan Poe always comes to mind. I absolutely love his work, and there's actually a lot in here that I don't think I ever read before. So, between that and reading some of these, it's been so long since I've read any Poe. So, it was a really good time getting through all of his stuff again. A couple of my favorite tales are The Pit and the Pendulum and of course, The Telltale Heart. A couple of my favorite poems are The Raven and A Dream Within a Dream. And lastly is Anoka by Shane Hawk, which I think covers the mythological aspect of this more than the classic aspects. I'm going to read the synopsis for this one as well. Welcome to Anoka, Minnesota, a small city just outside of the Twin Cities, dubbed the Halloween capital of the world since 1937. Here before you lie several tales involving bone collectors, pagan witches, werewolves, skeletal bison, and clone children. It is up to you to decipher between fact and fiction, as the author has woven historical facts into his narratives. So, first off, I will say that I had no idea that Anoka, Minnesota was the Halloween capital of the world. Pretty cool, and now I really want to go there on Halloween. And this was a really enjoyable collection of Indigenous horror. My favorites were Soilborn, Wounded, Imitate, and Transfigured. And what I especially liked are the story notes in the back of the book. The author kind of further explains like what inspired him to write the story and what he thought the importance of each one was. So like I would read the story, then flip and read the story notes. In most cases, it made me enjoy the story even more. So I just love that little extra touch. All right, so that's it for the books. Let's talk about the movies that I watched. First is The Fly. Yes, I watched the 1986 film, which starred Jeff Goldblum, which I somehow totally missed the fact that he was in this movie, so that was a nice treat. This is about a scientist whose experiments goes horribly wrong. Oh, man. I see why this is on a lot of people's classic lists. Now, I can see how, like, in the 80s, this was probably considered quite graphic. And I have to admit, I thought the graphics and special effects were pretty good for their age. And, you know, the scientists part of it and the experiments, again, pretty advanced for the 80s, which... You know, I can't go wrong about a scientist and his experiments, I think. Next is Rebecca. I mainly wanted to watch this because I knew I was going to be reading the book. I would say this follows pretty closely to the book premise, which I talked about earlier. Now, I might have done myself a disservice by watching the 2020 film and not the original 1940s. But I can always go back and watch it. I thought... excuse me. I thought it was a decent movie. It followed the book fairly well. And, you know, while a few things change, some things change, which I didn't appreciate. Lily James and Armie Hammer, I thought did a great job as Mr. and Mrs. De Winter. And I believed the chemistry that they had, which I think is really important to the plot. So, all in all, not too bad. Next is Candyman. So I know the plot of Candyman, but how the heck have I been around this long in my life and, like, never watched it? Tragic. This is about the Candyman, an urban legend in a housing project in Chicago, and a journalist, while investigating the legend, ends up summoning the Candyman. I really liked this. It had some really good jump scares, and It's pretty creepy. Like, I definitely wouldn't want the Candyman stalking after me. And if you've seen the movie, then the beat scene, you know what I'm talking about. But, oh, that gives me the heebie-jeebies. Now I am all the more interested in watching the 2021 remake for this movie now. And lastly is Psycho. Okay, so I admit that I have seen the remakes, but never like the original Hitchcock film. And I think when people talk about classic horror and Psycho, they're talking about this movie, not any of the remakes. So, again, what have I been doing with my life that I haven't seen this movie? This is about Norman Bates, who runs a remote hotel and who may or may not be a serial killer. Let me tell you something. Anthony Perkins, who is Norman Bates in this movie, freaking makes the movie. He is so creepy. His acting is just spot on for this movie. It's like unsettling, and it just makes you feel funny and awkward, and creepy and horrifying, which is all of the things you expect in that kind of a movie. So I certainly think it deserves its spot as a classic horror movie. All right, now let's talk about my recommendations. We'll do the books first. I have 4 of them. Dracula by Bram Stoker. Jonathan Harker visits Transylvania to help Count Dracula purchase a London house and ends up uncovering a few frightening things about the Count. I mean, like, what's left to say about this? I actually just talked about this book in my October wrap-up because I reread it this year. But to me, when I think classic horror, this is the book that comes to mind. And it's a classic in its own right. Maybe not the first original Dracula, but I think it's the one that most people, when they think about vampires and Dracula, they refer to this book. There's lovely graphic or gothic atmospheric setting, the characters, down to the way that the story is written. I think everything just comes together so beautifully, and it is a favorite of mine, and it will always be a favorite. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is a novel about a scientist whose creation becomes a monster. The thing that I love so much about this was that Mary Shelley wrote this when she was like 18. I'm blown away. Like, of course it's hard to separate the Hollywood version of Frankenstein from the true creation in this book. But even for someone at that age to create such complicated, tortured souls, both Victor Frankenstein and his creation are flawed, and the events that they both experience are heartbreaking, and there's some really hard topics about, obviously the ethics about doing this type of an experiment, and grief and loneliness, and such a good book, and I hope it always remains a classic. Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This is the point of view of Lewis as he recounts his journey through mortal and immortal life at the side of his creator and mentor, Vampire Lestat. As it says in the book, it centers on the themes of immortality, change, loss, sexuality, and power. And yes, it does, and is the reason I absolutely loved this series growing up. This is the first book in the Vampire Chronicles, and I think it's a classic because it really took the vampire trope by storm. And last book recommendation I have is Carrie by Stephen King. I don't think I can have a classic horror list and not include a Stephen King. Especially Stephen King's first novel. Carrie is about a sheltered girl with telekinetic powers. After a prank at the prom, Carrie becomes something truly to fear. Like I said, this is Stephen King's first novel, and it is one of my favorites. I think Stephen King has a knack for taking very real themes, in this case, like bullying, even obviously back in the day, like that was still a real thing, and intermixing them with these supernatural elements in a way that you kind of think back and you're like, who's like the real monster here? And of course, Stephen King is just a classic horror author. I think when a lot of people think horror, they think Stephen King. So I think this book earns its rightful place on a classic horror list. Now let's talk about the 4 movie recommendations that I have. First is Silence of the Lambs. An FBI agent ends up enlisting the help of a cannibal killer to help catch a serial killer. First off, you really should watch this just for the sole purpose of seeing Anthony Hopkins acting in this. Like, he's just creepy as hell. And again, acting as Suburb. This is based on the novel by Thomas Harris. I really have loved any Hannibal content I can get my hands on since watching this movie. And actually, I have watched all of the Hannibal movies, but I don't think I've read all the books. So that may be a challenge for me next year. And I think there are so many references to this movie, like even to this day, and just other like social media content or other movies, other TV shows. And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And for that, that's why I consider this a classic horror movie. Creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, I'm talking about the original black and white 50s film, which is about a beast in the Amazonian jungle who attempts to get captured by a group of scientists for study. Now, to me, I think this is kind of where the monster stuff emerged. Don't hold that statement to me, but I think this was kind of the first creature feature, and I then devoured many like it, such as The Mummy, The Wolfman, The Invisible Man, etc. Like, all of those kind of came in the same era. And I think a lot of the tropes that we see today, obviously, this movie had it way back in the day, and even some technical movie magic. I seemed a little advanced for its age. You know, there's some camera scenes like underwater, which is crazy to think, you know, they had the skill and knowledge and movie, I don't know what you call it, like movie graphics to film stuff underwater. So, yeah, just a good one. Halloween. I start this by saying this is the one that started it all. This is a classic slasher film and started such a large franchise that we are still making movies about to this day. That's a feat in itself. So this is about Michael Myers, who escapes from a mental hospital and returns to Illinois for a killing spree. I mean, you think it's like an over-the-top slasher movie, and it really is, but I love me some Michael Myers. And of course, you know, I think we have other movies that fall into this trope, like Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Scream, you know, just to name a few, but to me, I think classic slasher is Halloween. All right, and the last recommendation is The Birds. Again, we're talking the original 60s film. I couldn't help but include another Alfred Hitchcock on the classic horror movie list. His movies deserve a place there. He's had so many that to this day remain a favorite, and The Birds is obviously one of those. It's about a Northern California town that slowly take a turn when birds decide to attack. Not gonna lie, some of the acting's a little subpar. And it's really not as scary as you think it is when you rewatch it. But it's still a classic. And what freaked me out the most was just that it wasn't like one bird. Like, just all the birds all of a sudden went crazy. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something you see so regularly that I think even to this day, like, you still think twice about being around birds. And come on, admit it. You duck when one's flying above your head. I knew it. Okay, yeah, that's all I have for this video. Drop a comment below and let me know what your favorite classic books and or movies are. Stay tuned for November. It's gonna be a fun, monstery time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.